Good afternoon. I'm Pat Nugent, Deputy Director of the Starr Center, and I'm absolutely thrilled that all of you could join in welcoming our Spring 2017 Patrick Henry Writing Fellow, Martha Saxton. The Henry Fellowship supports historians who, in addition to the scholarly and intellectual value of their work, also strive to reach a broad general public. It was established with a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, together with a generous gift from the Nuttall family, descendants of Patrick Henry. In recognition of that special connection, the Henry Fellowship targets work on the history and legacy, broadly defined, of the American Revolutionary era and the nation's founding ideas. I'd like to thank our donors, as well as the Rose O'Neill Literary House, which co-sponsors the Henry Fellowship, members of the Faculty Selection Committee, and the English Department, which is hosting the course on biography and fiction that Dr. Saxton is teaching this semester. To give a sense of just how broad the Henry Fellowship scope is, just consider our two most recent fellows. Our fall 2016 fellow, David Carter, was researching the ideas and leadership behind the early gay rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. Our spring fellow is completing the first modern biography of Mary Ball Washington, the mother of the father of our country. In other words, this is a moment when I might be tempted to say, and now for something completely different. But on second thought, maybe the two scholars' work isn't so completely different. Both engage with questions of gender and sexuality, with the political empowerment of often marginalized groups, and with the history of American revolutions. The emphasis on plural, revolutions, of governance, yes, but also of mind, body, and spirit. In other words, with issues of liberty and equality, those topics that preoccupied our nation's founders and continue to loom large today. Since the Henry Fellows stay at Washington College for an entire semester, in some cases a year, living in a colonial house on Queen Street and working within the Custom House, they truly become valued members of our community. They usually teach a course or often mentor our students in many other ways. And at the start of their fellowship, we always invite them to speak here on campus, to share their work with you, and to introduce them to the college and Chestertown. So Dr. Saxton will do that in just a moment, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit about her career as a historian. As professor of history and sexuality, women's and gender studies at Amherst College, Dr. Saxton is a leading scholar in her field. But before entering the academy, she enjoyed a 2-decade career as a journalist and author writing for the general public, which she'll tell you more about in a few minutes. Her first 2 books were a biography of Louisa May Alcott and a biography of the 1950s pinup icon Jane Mansfield. Her last major scholarly book, Being Good: Women's Moral Values in Early America, was an ambitious, path-breaking, and influential study of women's lives. Her current book, The Widow Washington, is under contract with one of the nation's leading trade publishers, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which ensures that it will draw readers from across a broad spectrum of readership. So we're excited that the Starr Center can pitch in to support this important project, and very honored to welcome Martha Saxton to Washington College. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for that. So I was just in the middle of saying what a wonderful, wonderful place this is to be, and what a wonderful fellowship, and what lovely people I'm working with, and what a extremely lovely town. I've never been to this part of Maryland, and it's just, and the house, I mean, it's just wonderful. There is one problem, which is that I've had to learn a lot of new passwords. And so I think I don't need to say too much more about that, except I wanted to say that I got comfort from an unusual source, and I offer it to you. I've been reading, as you might imagine, a lot of George Washington's letters. And in one of them, he's writing to a subordinate with whom he's, I believe, trying to set up a spy ring. I tended to sort of look for the Mary Ball Washington, content of the letters, so this wasn't actually something I followed too closely. But he did say this: "It runs in my head that I was to correspond with you by a fictitious name. If so, I forgot the name. And must be reminded of it again. I am, sir, your most obedient servant, G. Washington." So I'll just go on for a moment to a couple of things that are that Patrick mentioned in his introduction, his very kind introduction. I have a pretty weird resume, and I will just explain a little bit about that before talking about Mary Bell Washington. I am a product of the 60s, and I got my feminism in the 60s. And I was an aspiring writer, and I chose Jane Mansfield as a kind of she was, for those of you who don't know, she was kind of a road company Marilyn Monroe. And she seemed sort of uncomplicated in many ways to me. She seemed straightforwardly ambitious and wanting to use her sexuality to exploit it. And she was spectacularly she was very successful, and then suddenly very unsuccessful. And I was very curious about what that meant, because I had just been living through a sort of a period that was so confusing to me that I thought maybe if I looked at somebody who is actually only really interested and ambitious for a career using her sexuality, I might understand something about the sexual revolution that I was living through. It didn't actually work out that way, but it was an interesting project in any case. My next book, Louisa May Alcott, it's a little unlikely as a pairing, but anyway, came out of a very deep love I had for Little Women. I read it over and over as a child, as I'm sure many women of my generation did. It gives you a sense of how ill-prepared I was for the 60s, that was my favorite childhood book. And when I began to research her life, my feelings about the book began to sort of curdle in a way. I read with increasing anger and disbelief her parents' journals, particularly her father's journals. And her adolescence, unlike Jo's, sort of a spunky 19th century girl trying to combat her own, sort of suppress her own temper and become a better little woman, wasn't really Alcott's story at all. She was really an anxious and miserable child, due largely to her father's refusal to support the family, but also her mother's over-identification with Louisa and her sort of drawing her into her embrace so closely that she gave Louisa her own journals to read as sort of both writing and emotional lessons about what to write about. So in a sense, many of Louisa's most successful books were kind of an exercise in ventriloquism. She was sort of writing for her mother. And the only time she really enjoyed fiction which is normally something that I think people find a certain kind of freedom in her case, her fiction, the fiction that she really enjoyed writing was her pseudonymous fiction, in which, women took drugs and murdered people that, who had done bad things to them and so on. So in both of those cases, I wasn't really trying to create or rescue a heroine. I was really trying to give a straight reading or a fair reading to women whom I felt for one reason or another had been misunderstood. Being Good was a much more straightforward set of community studies in which they were sort of more biographies of groups of women than they were actually biographies of individual women. looking at moral values in different communities for different women and sort of how those played out for women over time. And it was in that book that I came across Mary Ball Washington. In a section, I did a section on 18th century Virginia. And I discovered that Mary and George had long and complicated disagreements over money. To anybody who knows much about Washington, this probably wasn't a big surprise, but it was quite a surprise to me, and I found it, I was disappointed in him. I was disappointed in what seemed to me a kind of a stinginess, since he was, at that point, I believe, or, at a certain point in his life, the richest man in Virginia. So in looking for more context for this story, I quickly came across a handful of incidents that come from among Washington's own documents, and that have, until recently, sort of constituted the bulk of the knowledge about Mary Ball Washington. There's some, famous and pretty well-known incidents. She didn't want him to go into the British Navy when he was 14 years old. This seems to me like a no-brainer, so I'm not going to say much about that one. She didn't want him to fight with Braddock in the first battle of the 7 Years' War. She wrote complaining of want or she complained to neighbors and friends of want in 1781, and this caused him great embarrassment, and he wrote to the friend who forwarded the story to him that she couldn't possibly be feeling any want, and so on and so on. There are a couple of other incidents like this, but I thought I'd just sort of sketch in her life and sort of go back to those and give some context to those incidents so that you can get a sense of how I'm trying to tell her story. But before I do that, I just wanted to quickly give you an overview of what has been said about her, because that's also part of the story. There's an accretion of different views of her, and it's important to understand that that's, that without much evidence, it's easy to do that. I mean, it's easy to talk about somebody and have lots of opinions about him or her if you don't have much evidence. So she's acquired a lot of different interpretations. In the early part of the 19th century, when the virtuous, when the nation needed its mothers to be Republican mothers and teach and raise good citizens, Mary figured as the angelic mother who raised George to be the perfect citizen. And so they became he much more importantly than she, but they became part of the sort of the story of our exceptionalism, the origins of our exceptionalism. As the 19th century went on, the kind of classic story, biographical story that was being told began to shift. Intellectual ideas from the continent, intellectual ideas from Freud and from other kinds of thinkers, complicated the notion. Instead of an earlier notion of sort of you play out your character, and that's sort of your story. The new sort of so-called therapeutic narrative, a biographical story that came to be the dominant form of biography in the late 19th and early 20th century, was more a story about early influences, a story about finding with the help of your parents who should facilitate this process, finding your individuality and your talents, and that over time you would live these out as long as there weren't too many obstacles to it. So parents start to can become a pretty serious obstacle, and particularly mothers in the therapeutic narrative. So Mary Ball Washington started not to do so well in these therapeutic narratives. She began to appear as a crude, practically illiterate, pipe-smoking, bad housekeeper, and it just went from bad to worse. Douglas Southwell Freeman, who is probably the most respected scholar of Washington, Still sort of, in some ways, the standard, the definitive biography in terms of the amount of research that went into it and the care and scrupulousness and so on. Called her selfish, crude, a bad manager, a woman of a disorderly mind. He wrote, mistress of much, mistress of little, mistress she was resolved to be, and in nothing more certainly than in deciding what should be done with her firstborn, her pride and her weakness. Flexner, James Flexner, who came after that, made this, took this to a sort of a more heated level and invented scenes. He had her going to Mount Vernon and stamping her foot and telling Washington not to fight with Braddock. Well, she did go to Mount Vernon, but the foot stamping is pretty hard to document. And but one of the things that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that seemed to be also hanging over these narratives was a kind of a whiff of homophobia, that if she'd really had her way, if she'd really done all the bad things she was trying to do, keeping him at home and being so possessive, that was, the idea was that she was terribly, terribly possessive, that the father of our country wouldn't have been heterosexual, and that would have been really quite a problem. Ron Chernow's new biography doesn't have this sort of passionate dislike of her, but it recycles the same old stuff. It's no new work has been done trying to figure out anything about her life. There were also 3 standalone biographies of Mary, all by women. They feature tremendous factual inaccuracies, I would say. Real enthusiastic use of documents that don't turn out to be about her, or portraits that aren't, of her, and so on. It's quite like the Wikipedia entry, which I keep changing, it's like a zombie, sort of rises from the dead, and the same portrait that isn't of her shows up again, and the same stories. And she met Augustine Washington in England, where she had never traveled. That's another one that shows up. In any case, to the credit of at least one of these biographers, Mary Terhune, who's was a famous writer in her own right in some ways, she at least understood something about the history of families, the history of childhood, which is an important theme in this book. Mary lived almost the entire 18th century, and she was raised her own children in a very specific style. Extensive mothering, it's called by historians. And it really is sort of, it posits a large family, which she had. And it means that you really work very hard to keep them alive and to get them to adulthood. But you aren't sort of hovering over them and focusing on everything that they feel. And you aren't making this very, very tender, close bond that's much more characteristic of the 19th century kind of mothering, and much more characteristic of late 18th century mothering, like the kind Martha Washington did of her children, a much more indulgent style, a much more tender and close style. So for some historians who simply assume that all mothering, all parenting is constant over time, this is another strike against her, that she was quite a different, but in terms of her own period, perfectly excellent mother. She was strict. She was tough. She wanted them to survive. In any case, these 3 biographies by women, unanchored as they are in any particular sense of factual accuracy, they do share a number of pretty reasonable premises, however, and I share them too. They are, by and large, trying to give her a sympathetic reading. They recognize that she was stoical and taciturn. This is not surprising given her upbringing, which I'll talk a little bit about. That as a widow with 5 young children to raise, she had many struggles and should be given some credit for doing as well as she did for those children. And that she loved her kids and that they had affection and respect for her as well, including Washington. And I think it's really, she stood as godmother to many of their children. There are all kinds of tokens, small tokens, that if you She was given a mourning ring by Lawrence, George's elder half-brother. There are all kinds of things that if you looked for them, you wouldn't say things like what Southwell Freeman said, that they had a horrible relationship, that she and Lawrence did nothing but struggle over George's. It's in these small details that we have to look to find out something about her. But I do think that it's a reasonable assumption to make that she had the respect and affection of her children, and she had conflict with them as well. Who here has parented without any conflict with his or her children? In any case, it was this kind of brew of lack of evidence, conflicting evidence, mess of wild interpretations that, it was, it intoxicated me. I couldn't stay away from it. I did think that there would be much more evidence that people hadn't turned up, and that's turned out to be sort of true. It hasn't turned out to be quite as true as I hoped. There's no cache of letters. There's no diary. There's nothing that really, where you go, that's who she is. But there's an enormous amount of material around the edges, and in probate records and in other kinds of records. So I'll just sketch now before I should have. Yeah, I'm running long, but I'll try not to go on forever. Genealogists very largely agree that Mary Bell Washington's mother was an indentured servant, which adds a very interesting kind of class mobility aspect to the whole story. Her name was Mary Johnson, possibly Mary Bennett Johnson, but no, it's not entirely clear what her maiden name was. In any case, she was when she became a widow, her name was Mary Johnson, and she married up. She married a wealthy landowner, Joseph Ball, who had many acres and many slaves. They had little Mary when Joseph was in his late 50s, early 60s, and then he died when Mary was 3. He left Mary 400 acres and 3 male slaves. She was born about 1708, 1709. It's not entirely clear. By the time she was 12, Mary had lost both parents, as well as a stepfather. Her mother remarried right after her marriage to Ball, and an elder half-brother. In this, she was not very different from lots and lots of children, black and white, in the Chesapeake in this period. A lot of historians have remarked on the very high death rate. People never knew their grandparents. Often, almost always lost one parent. Losing 2 plus a stepfather puts her in the category of real trauma. But in any case, it wasn't trauma that nobody else had experienced in that cohort. Historians don't like to talk about the repercussions. They don't like to speculate about it. But I think if you don't, you really. I think you can't help it. Simply, just because lots of people experience the same thing doesn't mean that lots of people didn't have emotional repercussions from these kinds of events. I think that if you don't think about numbness, about unpredictable displacement of anger and grief, regression, all of the things that inevitably accompany these kinds of losses, you can't understand the development of her, and also, in many ways, a whole generation of Virginians. She lived with her mother and her 2 elder half-siblings. Her mother had 2 older children by the husband Johnson, until Mary was about 12, when her elder half-brother died and then her mother died. We don't know a lot about this period, but we do know that she learned to read and write, which her mother had not known how to do, but made it possible for her to learn. She learned many household skills, which she continued to perfect. And she learned to be a very, very good horse rider, much like her son would become. She stayed on and lived with her half-sister, who inherited the house, the small house that they were living in. And, but her half-sister was already married and pregnant. And so she, at 12, she basically stopped being this anybody's special child. I mean, she stepped into adulthood, like many children in that period. Not too long after her mother's death, the overseer who had been working for her mother sued successfully the family for back wages, and so one of her earliest impressions or views of life right after her mother's death was of this guy going away with barrels and barrels of their corn and their salt and their other provisions. So the obsession that she had later in her life with want, I think, it's not hard to begin to see where it's coming from. She's been described as having a commanding presence as well as a temper. Freeman accused her of being imperious, an imperious boss of those who worked for her. George, of course, was famously imperious but not criticized for it. I would simply suggest that I don't think imperiousness is a great quality in anybody, male or female, but I do think that if you're a three-year-old girl and you own 3 male slaves, you probably better learn to command them pretty fast, or you're not going to survive very long in this atmosphere. I think it's perfectly understandable that she would have watched her mother pushing people around to get work out of them, to make them do what she wanted, learn how to do that, and that became part of her identity and part of her character very young. She married Augustine Washington when she was 22 or 23. He was, like her, he was a protege of Mary's very wealthy neighbor, George Eskridge. And Augustine was also related to him through his first wife. Mary's mother had been a good friend of Eskridge's and asked him to sort of look after her in her will. Augustine also was very interested in iron ore, and Mary's lands were quite near some that he already owned that had iron ore on them. So there were lots of reasons why this was a convenient and a good marriage. He had a daughter that was in this country. His 2 sons were in school in Great Britain, but he needed a housekeeper. He needed somebody to take care of him. He needed a companion. Widowers remarried. Widows remarried. Everybody remarried in this period, and she was available. And this was for her a marriage up, very much like her mother's last marriage. So they married. The content of their marriage or the tone of it is hard. It's hard for me to say, but I do think that she had 6 children in 13 years of marriage. It doesn't mean that they had a wonderful relationship, but it means they had a steady sexual relationship, and that there weren't obstacles to that part of their life. He was away a lot. He was affable, apparently. So if she had a temper, he apparently didn't have so much of a temper. And he gave her gifts. I'm just going to sort of change the scene up here. These are excavations at the house that she and Augustine lived in when George was probably started. They moved there when George was about 4. This is her house that George bought for her when she was much older, when they had sold the Ferry Farm house. And this is the house that Betty and her husband Fielding, Betty was her second, after George, she had Elizabeth. And this was Elizabeth and Fielding Lewis's house in Fredericksburg. These are the kinds of things that It's not the particular teapot that Augustine bought her, but he kept her in lovely teapots. She had a whole series of them. The archaeologists have recovered many of them. And she obviously loved tea. She bought all different kinds of tea. And she, both her husband and her son gave her lovely teaware, very up to date, so she'd get rid of the earlier ones. She had mirrors like this. Augustine gave her something I don't have a picture of. This is actually something that is at her house, at the house in Fredericksburg, which I just find interesting. They were, I believe, her wine glasses, and something that you swished your wine glass in to clean it. It had water in it, and you would just, so I had never seen one of those. I thought that was cool. Fan, for example, decorative things that she was given. So did they have a great love affair? I have no idea. But I think they got along as well as, I mean, marriage was pretty oppressive for women in the 18th century. Given that, I think they got along as well as most couples probably did in that period. I wanted to say one thing about sort of trying to find Mary's voice, because, of course, that's one of the big issues. Her letters don't represent her voice. Her letters are really very painfully written and with very limited vocabulary, and that's, I do not believe, representative. It's not what you would have encountered if you met her. The one thing that she had that that sort of marks her as unusual for her, at least for the class into which she ascended, I guess, is that she didn't read novels the way most of the elite women of the period did. She had 5 devotional books that the first of them was one I believe her older brother gave her. It's not clear, but I have a lot of reasons which anybody can ask me about to think that he gave her this book before she was married. She then went on to receive the devotional book that her husband, that Augustine's late wife had. So under that name, Mary wrote in her own name. And she got 3 more books, one by James Hervey and one by Matthew Hale that several of her grandchildren and George talk about her reading and quoting from. I think that one of the things that novel readers do, historians love this, the sort of historians of literary culture write a lot about this, and talk about sort of the interior changes that happened in the 18th century to people who read narrative fiction. One of the things is it is believed that it increased people's empathy and ability to sort of place themselves in other situations and imagine how other people felt. Another thing that historians write about is the notion that you, from reading novels, you develop your own self-story, your own narrative, and that you integrate your experience into the ongoing story of your own life. And that this is really, when they talk about making identity, when they talk about self and other and self and identity coming into being in the 18th century, this is a very important part of it. Mary did not read those kinds of books. And I believe that the kind of interior monologue she had was much more sort of aphoristic. It was much more that this is a good thing to do and that is not a good thing to do, that this is how you do things and this is not how you do things, and these are the reasons, and she read these books over and over and over again, meditated on them, and if you do that, they become the furniture of your mind, and she would quote them back to the grandchildren, to the children, to the grandchildren. And in fact, one of the things that I think is most sort of riveting about this is that they are in George's letters, particularly when he's a young man. Particularly, there's an early letter in which he writes to one of the Fairfax women. They were really girls. They were 16 or 17. And he's giving her advice about how to behave or how to feel when, I can't remember if it's her fiancé or her husband goes away. And he gives her this moral little sermonette that comes right out of these kinds of books that Mary had. And you see it in his letters to her later, to his mother. He's always using her own, sort of arguments to tell her sort of how to behave as an older woman. And so I think that's the kind of voice I'm imagining her, a somewhat a didactic and sermonic almost kind of voice. Let me not go on too long here. I did want to say one thing about the disputes over money and the last sort of great embarrassment that George suffered in 1781 when he wrote to Benjamin Harrison that he couldn't imagine that his mother had any want at all. She had imaginary wants, and everybody in the family, wanted to take care of her, would make any sacrifice for her. But the context for the Mary's pleas in 1781 that she didn't have enough to eat or enough money or enough anything are that she had, in the spring of 1781, the British were approaching. They had occupied Williamsburg. They were moving on to Petersburg, and it was thought that they were going to occupy Fredericksburg. Cornwallis was there with 7,000 troops, and it was thought that he was coming into Fredericksburg. And I think it's Lafayette, but in any case, people in Fredericksburg were evacuated. Mary had been sick that spring, quite sick. Fielding Lewis, her dear son-in-law, whom she loved, Betty's husband, was also very sick. He'd been sick for a while, and he got worse that spring. They all moved to Frederick County, not only the Lewises and Mary, but also her son Charles and his family, and her son Samuel and his family, where they had land out in the west, in Berkeley County, in Frederick. So they go out there, having been sick or being sick, and in the fall of that year, just as wonderful things are happening, Yorktown is happening, and all these good things are happening, Samuel dies, and then Lewis dies within 3 weeks of each other at the end of in December of 1781. Betty also gets terribly sick and is left with, I don't know if she knew this was going to be the case, but she's left with mountains of debt. The Lewises were up to their eyeballs in debt, and she's completely distressed. So the people that Mary is depending on are falling like flies. I mean, they've all died, and she's an old woman, and she doesn't know really how to take care of herself. And it's in that context that she talks to neighbors and to friends about being a terrible want. Not knowing, and they suggest apparently a pension of some kind, and then all hell breaks loose when George hears about that, and of course nothing ever happens, nor does it really need to. But I think it's important to know, to imagine, since we are all novel readers here, have the empathy to imagine what it was like to be her and sort of feel all the supports giving away. Betty wrote George Washington 4 letters in that period, only one of which in 1783, 2 years later, did he answer. He was quick to answer Benjamin Harrison and say, oh, everybody's taking care of my mother. But he never even wrote a letter of condolence to Betty in that very desperate period. I'm not criticizing. Washington had many things to do. I'm not saying he didn't call, he didn't write. I'm just saying I think there are several sides to these stories that have come down to us always as Mary being, over the top, needy, grasping, so on and so on. And I think I should leave it at that because I've gone on for a long time. And if there are questions, I'd love to take them.
Tradition has it we begin with a question from a student.
Yes, yes. I misspoke if that's what I said. I'm sorry. There have been the sources that I used, and we didn't actually go into some of that material. There's plenty of litigation that the Ball family engaged in. They were a very litigious bunch, and Mary's mother learned to do that too. She was loved being in court, apparently, spent a lot of time there. So there's quite a lot of that kind of evidence that nobody's really looked very much at. There's a lot of probate evidence because people are dying all over the place and they're all related to each other, and so you find an enormous amount out from wills about how property is being passed, but also to some degree how people feel about each other, because there are enmities played out, there are preferences, all that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of that, and there's also the reading around of George's own records. If you read them with a very particular eye to her, you'll see, for example, when he was 15 years old and they had zero money. His father had died 4 years before. There wasn't enough corn for him to feed his horse to go to an event that he wanted to go to. He paid for his own dancing lessons, paid his mother back for them. So that's in his account book. So there are those kinds of, that kind of stuff has always been there. But there's also, there are wonderful letters from Mary's elder half-brother on her father's side. He left a letter book of letters to his overseer. He went to England and then wrote back, to manage the farm, and there are all kinds of letters of instruction to the overseer that have a lot of, local evidence in them. So there is stuff. It's just you've got to sort of prowl around and look at it that way. Yeah. Yes.
You said something to the effect that her writings and the language did not properly reflect her education, her speaking, how she lived. That's what
Again, I probably didn't speak quite clearly enough. It reflected her level of education, of literacy, which was not great. It did not reflect, I think, how she spoke or how she came across as a person, because she didn't like to write and she didn't do it very well. And if that's true, when that's true, people have much greater verbal vocabularies than they do written, unless you're a big reader, unless you really care about the written word. She didn't have time. She didn't, she wrote asking for, butter, or she wrote saying she didn't have very much food, or, she wrote very, very concise and not sequential necessarily. She didn't build an argument. She just wrote some phrases and so, but I don't think that's how she was, as you know, how she expressed herself verbally. That's what I meant to say. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. No, they were in Fredericksburg, and then they moved to Berkeley County. It's in Virginia. It's over the Blue Hills. I don't know exactly where it is because I haven't been there yet, but it's in Virginia, in Western Virginia. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, of course.
I was just trying to place this. If she was born in 1708 in an area, well, it's still really, it's still to some extent. But it's not until after the Revolution that they actually start going over the mountains. So it's still pretty rough country. And listen to this. This is what's kind of cool. One is an indentured servant, and she marries up into a low country. And that's a big time as far as I can place it, and there's still that flexibility because it's not until Mary is an adult marrying that the more rigid lines of caste are joined. And I'm thinking the bigger path. It's coming years after contact and stuff.
Yep.
Finally, build
Yep.
great mansions.
Yep.
And that's what it's going to be. And her son himself, he marries
He marries way up.
his whole life is built around that insurance.
That's right.
I think she's doggone extraordinary. And how wonderful that for a woman to even write a letter and say, hey, how about me? And that
She is extraordinary, and the whole sort of set. I think you're absolutely right, and it's really important to put her in that broader context. That's really true. I also think she was really gritty. She was really convinced of her goals and her ability to accomplish for her children what her mother had tried to accomplish for her. Her mother's litigation was all about getting the extra. Her husband Richard. She married a guy named Richard Hughes right after Joseph Ball died, and then Hughes died. Meanwhile, Hughes was litigating with people to get back, I don't know, an old broken bucket and a couple of shovels from, whatever the inventory said that this guy had. If he owed him 400 pounds of tobacco, he wanted his 400 pounds of, or the bucket or the shovel or whatever would make that. And Mary the mother, Mary Sr., continued to do that kind of litigation. And when Mary, Mary George's mother, was a widow, she did not remarry for many of the same reasons. In Augustine's will, he had said that if she remarried, the man she married would have to pony up security, substantial security, and oversee the education and estates of the four boys that Augustine had left land to. And if he failed to do that, it would all be taken away from him. So if she remarried, she jeopardized all of that for her sons. And there were a lot of reasons, I think, why she didn't remarry in a culture where you absolutely did remarry. But I think one of them was to do what her mother did and make sure that her kids hung on to what she thought was theirs. Because that's really it's the struggle of this class in this period, is to sort of just hang on to what's yours and add to it. So, yeah. Other questions? Okay. Oh yes, please. Yeah, she. Wait a minute. He became, I always get, she lived to be 80, so she died in 89. But doesn't Rob Lewis go and tell him when he's president that she has just died. So yeah, so I've got my dates are a little off, but she did, yeah. She lived much longer than he did, as a sort of span of years than George did. But yes, she did. Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned correcting the Wikipedia page on Mary Paul Washington. And I also saw on your faculty page that you like to assign to students, or you have assigned to students, having students intervene with the Wikipedia page and kind of do the research. So I'm wondering if you could speak to either that assignment and which started first. Did you start correcting the Wikipedia page and then make the assignment, or if you could speak to that?
Sure.
Usefulness of that assignment.
It's fun. It's fun. I mean, Wikipedia is sort of like, sand pouring through your fingers. And I was actually the idea for using a Wikipedia assignment in my women's history course came from a colleague who was in IT and who was showing me the inaccuracies and also, but particularly the real absence of material on women, African American women. It's just Wikipedia is ridiculous in that. It's a really, really, and they have all kinds of committees of people working on it. And then what their solution to that problem is to divide up the revolution into the revolution and then the women and the revolution. So nobody ever goes to that. Anyway, don't get me started. But so it seemed to me that making these interventions, having my students write things that interested them that came out of what we were reading and what we were doing in the women's history course, they could, with a well-researched paper, they could edit, put it on Wikipedia and put something, not just biographies, but I had one wonderful a student somebody who did something on the gold rush, women in the gold rush, somebody who did something on Social Security. I mean, all kinds of things that, somebody Reconstruction. I mean, there were things that were really valuable and important interventions. Some of them disappeared. One woman, this was actually very, very telling. She wanted to write something about nurses in Vietnam, because she had a relative who had done that. And the amount of vituperation and rage and unwillingness to have anything about women on the Vietnam page, they patrol it, I mean, these people who just, some of the more politicized pages are just sort of watched all the time. And they take down stuff immediately. So it was interesting in a lot of different ways. But the Mary Bell Washington the inaccuracy of that was one of the many things that this IT friend and I were sort of, was a motive for doing this, because it just seemed like such an obvious opportunity. And instead of taking your term paper and throwing it in the wastepaper basket, it might last for a little while, and it might actually offer, something useful. So, what's that? Yeah.
At what point in our history did the relationship between Mary and John, I'm assuming, forces the son to the son when he takes charge of his mother as she gets older? Bigger was purchased. At what point in our time was that? Maybe it doesn't matter.
I'm not sure I understand exactly. You mean? You mean for real in their lifetime? Oh, I think he was. Well, he never really took control of her, I'd have to say. He wanted to. He tried pretty hard. He sold the Ferry Farm in about 1770 and told her and bought this house that that is that one. And she moved there, and Kenmore is right right close to it, and she and Betty were neighbors. But she'd go out to the Ferry Farm all the time, and the house, I think, wasn't theirs anymore, but the land was, much of the land was there, and so she continued to oversee that. And she would have been, so blah, 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 so 50, is that right? 60? 60. And then he tries again in 1787 and tells her to break up housekeeping, and, you know, but she can't come and live in Mount Vernon because that wouldn't be so great, because he wouldn't like that. Or she wouldn't like it. And in fact, anyway, I'm going on too long. Yeah, I mean, I think he kept trying, and but he never. I don't think he ever really wanted to squash her. I think he just wanted her to behave differently. Isn't that sort of what we all want? You know? I don't know. Anyway. Other questions? Thank you.